He almost drove past him, and for a second, that would have been the end of it. The old mail truck rattled along the quiet suburban road, tires crunching lightly over loose gravel, engine humming like it had done for years without complaint, and Daniel Carter kept his eyes forward the way he always did, focused on the route, the schedule, the next mailbox, anything that didn't ask too much of him, anything that didn't remind him of the things he had learned to leave behind. The morning air was cool, somewhere around 50 degrees, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, the kind of morning most people would call peaceful. But to Daniel it was just another stretch of miles to get through. Then something moved. Small. Sudden. Right in front of the truck. He hit the brakes harder than he meant to, the vehicle jerking to a stop with a hollow clatter, and for a moment there was only silence, the engine idling, his hands tied on the wheel. In the middle of the road stood a puppy. Too small to be out here alone. A German shepherd, maybe 8 weeks old, its fur a mix of dusty brown and black, ears not fully upright yet, body trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. It didn't run. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Most strays would bolt at the sound of an engine, disappear into yards or under porches, but this one stayed exactly where it was, looking straight at him. Not barking, not whining, just watching. Daniel exhaled slowly, already feeling the weight of something he didn't want to carry. "Come on, kid," he muttered under his breath, more out of habit than kindness. "Move along." He tapped the horn lightly. The sound echoed down the empty street, bouncing off parked cars and quiet houses. The puppy flinched, but it didn't leave. Instead, it took a step forward, then another, each movement careful, unsteady, like it had already used up most of its strength just getting here. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't his job. He delivered mail, envelopes, packages, things with addresses and clear destinations. Not problems, not stray animals, not anything that could look at him like that. He shifted in his seat, ready to inch the truck forward, to nudge the moment away and keep going. But the puppy came closer, close enough now that he could see the dirt clinging to its coat, the faint outline of ribs beneath fur that should have been fuller, healthier, close enough to see its eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't scared in the way abandoned animals usually were. They were focused, intent, like it had made a decision. The puppy reached the side of the truck and stopped, lifting its head just enough to meet his gaze through the open window. For a second, neither of them moved. The world felt strangely still, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then the puppy did something Daniel wouldn't forget. It turned away, took a few steps down the road, then stopped again and looked back. Waiting. Not lost. Not wandering. Waiting. Daniel frowned, a flicker of irritation mixing with something else he didn't want to name. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head as if the dog could understand. "Not today." But the words felt thinner than they should have. The puppy took a few more steps, slower this time, glancing back again, its small body swaying slightly with each movement. There was no bark, no sound at all, just that silent insistence. "Follow me." Daniel's fingers loosened on the steering wheel. He stared ahead, then at the puppy, then back at the empty stretch of road behind it. He could leave, drive around, finish his route. No one would know. No one would ask. That was the easiest path, the one he had chosen 100 times before. But something in the way the puppy stood there, fragile and stubborn all at once, pressed against a place in him he had spent years trying to quiet. He swallowed, the memory of a much smaller hand gripping his finger flashing through his mind, gone as quickly as it came. The engine idled. The seconds stretched. And without fully deciding to, Daniel reached for the door handle. The truck fell silent as he turned it off, the ticking of cooling metal filling the air. When he stepped out onto the road, the morning felt colder than before. The puppy didn't run. It just watched him, as if it had known all along he would get out. As if, somehow out of everyone in the world, it had chosen the only person who might actually follow. The gravel shifted softly under Daniel's boots as he stepped away from the truck, the quiet of the neighborhood pressing in around him like something fragile that could break if he moved too fast. And for a moment he just stood there, unsure of what he was doing or why he had even gotten out. But the puppy did not hesitate. It turned again and continued down the road with that same uneven determination, glancing back every few steps to make sure he was still there, as if this had never been a question, as if the choice had already been made somewhere beyond logic or routine. and Daniel let out a slow breath before following, his stride cautious at first, then steadier as the distance between them closed, the morning air brushing cool against his face, carrying the distant hum of a lawn mower and the faint metallic clink of a wind chime from a nearby porch. Ordinary sounds that felt strangely distant compared to the quiet urgency unfolding in front of him. The puppy veered off the main road and onto a narrow side path that cut between two aging fences, the wood worn pale by years of sun and rain, weeds pushing up through cracks in the dirt like they had been left to claim the space for themselves. Daniel hesitated at the entrance, glancing back once at the mail truck sitting alone in the street, engine off, door open, a reminder of the life he was supposed to be continuing. But when he looked forward again, the puppy had stopped just beyond the fence line, standing still, waiting again, always waiting. And something in that patience unsettled him more than panic would have, because panic could be ignored, dismissed. But this quiet insistence felt deliberate, almost purposeful. He stepped through the narrow opening, the fabric of his uniform brushing against splintered wood, and followed as the path curved gently behind a row of overgrown bushes, their branches heavy and untrimmed, leaves brushing against his arms with a soft rustle. The ground here was uneven. Patches of dry dirt mixed with damp soil that held the faint scent of decay and old rain, and the deeper he went the more the world behind him seemed to fade, the street noise dimming, the open sky narrowing between leaning structures and tangled branches, until it felt like he had stepped into a place that had been forgotten by everyone except the small creature leading him. The puppy slowed now, its steps shorter, its breathing more visible in the subtle rise and fall of its ribs, and Daniel noticed how often it paused, not just to look back, but to steady itself, as if whatever strength had carried it this far was beginning to thin. "Hey," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop it, softer than he intended. "Easy there." The puppy's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, not fully upright, not fully relaxed, just aware, and it moved forward again, pushing through a final cluster of weeds until the path opened into a small clearing behind what looked like an abandoned house. The structure leaned slightly to one side, paint peeling in long faded strips, windows clouded with dust and time, the kind of place people passed without looking twice, the kind of place that collected silence. Daniel slowed his steps, something tightening in his chest as he took in the scene. The puppy stopped near the edge of the clearing and turned toward him one last time, its gaze holding his in a way that felt almost human, steady and searching, and then it walked toward the house, not rushing, not frantic, just certain. Daniel followed more slowly now, each step measured, the wooden boards of the small back porch creaking faintly under his weight as he approached. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, carrying a faint, unfamiliar scent he could not quite place. And as he stood at the threshold, looking at the partially open door swaying slightly on its hinges, he realized this was the point where he could still turn back, where he could tell himself he had done enough, that he had followed far enough. But the puppy had already crossed inside, disappearing into the dim interior without hesitation. And after a brief moment that stretched longer than it should have, Daniel stepped forward and followed it in. The air inside the house was cooler than outside, but it was not the kind of cool that felt refreshing. It was still and stale, like time had settled here and refused to move. And Daniel paused just past the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through dust-coated windows, faint beams stretching across the floor and catching particles that drifted slowly in the silence. The wooden boards beneath his boots creaked with each step, the sound echoing softly through the empty space. And for a moment, he wondered how long it had been since anyone had stood here, really stood here, not just passed by or glanced in. But the thought faded quickly when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost mistook it for the house itself settling. A thin, fragile whimper carried through the stillness, and the puppy ahead of him stopped immediately, ears twitching, body tensing in a way that was no longer uncertain but purposeful. It moved forward again, faster now despite its small frame, weaving between scattered debris on the floor, old newspapers curled at the edges, a broken chair leaning against the wall, a forgotten space that had quietly collected pieces of what used to be. Daniel followed, his pace quickening without fully realizing it, his focus narrowing to that sound, that barely their thread of life pulling him deeper into the house. "Hello," he called out, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone he used when approaching something unknown, but it felt strange here. Swallowed almost immediately by the walls, there was no answer, only that faint whimper again, and the puppy reached a doorway at the far end of the room, pausing just long enough to look back at him before slipping through, disappearing into the darker interior beyond. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the air, something heavier, more familiar, the kind of feeling he had spent years learning to avoid, but he stepped forward anyway, crossing the threshold and into what looked like an old living room. The curtains hung unevenly, one side torn, letting in a thin slice of gray light that cut across the floor and revealed a shape in the corner, still at first glance, but not empty. The puppy moved directly toward it, slowing as it approached, its steps careful now, almost reverent, and when it reached the corner it let out a soft sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, something in between, something that carried meaning without words. Daniel took another step, then another, until the shape came into focus, and he stopped, his breath catching slightly as the scene unfolded in front of him. There, curled against the wall, was a larger German shepherd, her coat dull but still marked with the familiar pattern of black and tan, her body still but not lifeless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths that spoke of exhaustion more than anything else. And pressed close to her side were several tiny forms, smaller even than the puppy who had led him here, their bodies barely moving, huddled together for warmth, their presence so quiet it was almost impossible to believe they were there at all. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, taking it in, the weight of the situation settling over him slowly, not as a shock, but as a realization that this was not random, this was not an accident. The puppy had not wandered into the street by chance. It had come for him. It had chosen him. And that understanding carried a kind of responsibility he had not felt in a long time. He exhaled slowly, stepping closer, his movements instinctively gentle now, careful not to startle, not to break whatever fragile balance held the room together. "Hey there," he said quietly, his voice softer than before, directed not just at the mother dog, but at the small cluster beside her, at the space itself. The puppy moved aside slightly, giving him room, its eyes fixed on him, watching, waiting, and for the first time since he stepped out of the truck, Daniel did not feel like he could walk away, not because he was being asked to stay, but because something inside him had already decided he would. Daniel crouched slowly, the worn floorboards groaning under his weight, and for a moment he did nothing but listen. The faint rhythm of shallow breathing, the soft shifting of tiny bodies pressed together, the quiet presence of the puppy beside him, and it all felt fragile in a way that made him instinctively lower his voice even further, as if anything louder might break whatever thin thread was holding this moment together. "You have been holding on, have you not?" he murmured, not expecting an answer, his eyes resting on the mother dog as her ears flicked slightly at the sound, not lifting her head, not moving much at all, but aware, still aware, and that alone told him enough. She was not gone. She was still fighting in the only way she could, quietly, without strength to spare. The small bodies at her side stirred faintly, one shifting just enough to press closer against her warmth, another letting out a soft, almost inaudible sound that barely reached the air, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, something old, something he had buried beneath routine and distance and silence. He reached out his hand, slowly, giving the mother dog time to react, to pull away if she needed to, but she did not. Her eyes opened just slightly, enough for him to catch the dull glint of awareness, and she watched him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that felt heavier, like recognition, like she knew why he was here, or maybe just hoped he did. His fingers brushed gently against her side, feeling the faint rise and fall beneath her fur, uneven but present, and he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You are not alone." The words lingered in the air, simple, but they carried a weight he had not spoken aloud in a long time. The puppy pressed closer to his leg, its small body leaning into him as if confirming the decision had been made. As if this was the moment everything shifted, Daniel glanced around the room, his mind beginning to move faster now, pushing past hesitation, scanning for anything he could use, anything that could help. There was an old blanket in the corner, thin and dusty but intact, a cardboard box near the wall that looked sturdy enough to carry weight, and a plastic container overturned near the doorway that might hold water if cleaned. Small things, but enough to begin. He stood and moved carefully, each step deliberate, aware of the fragile lives behind him. He shook out the blanket as gently as he could, sending a faint cloud of dust into the air that caught in the dim light, then laid it down closer to the mother dog, creating a cleaner space, a small improvement in a place that had seen too little care. The puppy followed his movements closely, never straying far, its eyes tracking every action as if memorizing them, as if this was what hope looked like. When he returned to the corner, he paused again, looking down at the small cluster, at the mother who had held on long enough for someone to arrive, at the tiny lives that had not yet had a chance to begin, and something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, not just responsibility, but resolve. He slipped one hand beneath the edge of the blanket and gently adjusted it around them, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The mother dog let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, her body relaxing just slightly under the new warmth, and that small change felt like a signal, like permission. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face in the dim room. His thumb hovered for a second before dialing, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because he knew that once he made this call, there was no turning back to the quiet, distant life he had been living. The line rang once, then twice, and as he listened, he looked back at the puppy, who stood steady now, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain, just watching him with that same unwavering focus. And Daniel understood something in that moment that he could not fully explain. This had never been about chance. It had been about being found. And before the voice on the other end of the line even answered, he already knew he was going to stay until help arrived. The call connected with a soft click, and Daniel turned slightly away from the corner as he spoke, his voice low but steady, giving the address as best as he could piece it together from memory and what he had seen outside, explaining in simple terms that there was a mother dog and several puppies in need of help. His words measured, practical, but underneath them there was something else, something urgent that he did not need to say out loud for it to be heard. And when the voice on the other end assured him that someone would be sent, that help was on the way, he nodded even though they could not see him, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," before ending the call and slipping the phone back into his pocket. The room returned to its stillness, but it felt different now, less uncertain, as if the act of reaching out had shifted something unseen. Daniel exhaled slowly and crouched again beside the small group, his attention returning to the mother dog and the puppies, to the quiet effort of staying alive that filled the space without sound. He glanced toward the doorway, calculating the time it might take for help to arrive. 10 minutes, maybe 20, longer if they had trouble finding the place. And the thought of waiting that long without doing anything settled uneasily in his chest. He looked around again, more deliberately this time, searching for anything that could make a difference in the minutes ahead. The plastic container near the doorway caught his eye, and he stood, moving quickly but carefully, picking it up and brushing away dust with the edge of his sleeve. It was not clean, but it was usable, and that would have to be enough. He stepped outside briefly, the sudden brightness of the morning making him blink as he crossed to a small patch of grass where dew still clung to the blades. Crouching low, he tilted the container and let the moisture gather slowly. Not much, but something. And when he returned inside, the cooler air wrapped around him again, the quiet waiting unchanged. He knelt beside the mother dog and placed the container within reach, dipping his fingers into the water and letting a few drops fall gently near her mouth. "Easy," he whispered, his tone soft, patient, and after a moment, she responded, just barely, a slight movement, a faint attempt. But it was enough to tell him she was still there, still trying, and that small effort felt larger than it should have, like a signal that things could shift if given the chance. The puppy moved closer, watching intently, its body no longer trembling but still carrying a tension that had not fully left. Daniel reached out and rested his hand lightly on its back, feeling the warmth beneath its thin fur. "You did good," he said quietly. The words simple, but they carried a sincerity he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. The puppy leaned into his touch, just slightly, as if acknowledging the connection, as if understanding more than it should, and for a brief moment, Daniel's gaze drifted, not to the room, not to the animals in front of him, but somewhere further back, somewhere he had not visited in years, a memory of a smaller hand, a softer voice, laughter that had once filled spaces like this with light, and the weight of that memory pressed in, not sharply, not painfully, but steadily, like something asking to be remembered rather than avoided. He swallowed and brought his focus back, grounding himself in the present, in what he could do here and now. He adjusted the blanket again, tucking it more securely around the puppies, making sure they were as close to their mother as possible, his movements careful, deliberate, guided by instinct more than experience. The minutes passed slowly, marked only by the faint sounds of breathing and the occasional shift of tiny bodies. And then, somewhere beyond the walls of the house, there was a sound, distant at first, then growing clearer, the low hum of an approaching vehicle. Daniel lifted his head, listening, and the puppy did the same, ears twitching, body alert, but not afraid. And as the sound drew closer, something in the room seemed to ease, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel like the beginning of something changing. Daniel rested his hand once more on the puppy's back, steady and present, and for the first time since stepping into the house, he allowed himself to believe that they were not too late. The sound grew louder, tires crunching over gravel somewhere beyond the overgrown path, followed by the low hum of an engine idling, and Daniel rose halfway from his crouch, listening carefully as the noise settled into place just outside the abandoned house. The puppy lifted its head fully now, ears twitching with alert focus, but it did not retreat. It stayed close, pressed near his leg as if this moment was something it had been waiting for all along. And then came the faint echo of a car door opening, a voice calling out from a distance, cautious but clear, "Hello, anyone here?" And Daniel exhaled, a breath that carried both relief and a strange reluctance, as if part of him had grown used to the quiet responsibility of the room and did not want to let it go too quickly. He stepped toward the doorway, careful not to disturb the mother dog and her puppies, and moved back through the dim hallway, his boots sounding softer now, more deliberate, until he reached the entrance and pushed the door open wider, letting more light spill into the house. Outside stood a white rescue vehicle, the emblem on its side catching the morning sun, and beside it a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a navy jacket with a medical kit slung over her shoulder, her posture alert but calm, her eyes scanning the property with practiced awareness. "In here," Daniel called, raising his hand slightly, and she turned immediately, moving toward him with steady steps. "You the one who called?" she asked as she approached, her voice direct but not unkind. "Yes," Daniel replied, stepping aside to let her pass. "Back room," he added, gesturing inside. She nodded once and entered without hesitation, her presence shifting the atmosphere almost instantly. Not louder, not rushed, but purposeful, like someone who had done this many times before. Daniel followed a step behind as she moved through the house, her eyes taking in details quickly, the layout, the condition, the path they had taken, and when they reached the corner of the living room, she slowed, her expression softening just slightly as she took in the sight. "All right," she murmured under her breath, setting her kit down carefully. "Hey there, Mama." Her voice changed subtly, gentler now, lower, as she knelt beside the mother dog, her movements confident but careful. She reached out with slow, practiced hands, checking breathing, positioning, the small signs that told her what she needed to know, and Daniel watched, standing just behind her, his hands at his sides, unsure of where to place them now that someone else had taken over, but not ready to step away either. The puppy stayed close to him, though its attention shifted toward the woman, its head tilting slightly as if trying to understand this new presence. "You did the right thing calling," the woman said without looking up, her focus still on the dog. "They have been here a while." Daniel nodded, though she could not see it. "She brought me," he said quietly, and for the first time, the words felt real, not strange, not unlikely, just true. The woman glanced briefly at the puppy, then back to the mother dog, a faint understanding passing through her expression. "They know," she said simply, as if that explained everything. She opened her kit and began preparing what she needed, her movements efficient, measured, each action building toward stability rather than urgency. And as she worked, the room seemed to breathe differently, the tension easing, not disappearing, but shifting into something steadier, something with direction. Daniel crouched. Again, closer this time, watching as the puppies stirred faintly, reacting to the subtle changes around them. And one of them, the smallest, shifted just enough to press its tiny paw against the edge of the blanket near his hand. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it held him there, rooted in place, and he did not move. He did not pull away. Instead, he let his hand rest nearby, open, present, as if that small connection mattered more than anything else in that moment. Outside, another vehicle approached, the faint sound of voices carrying in, more help arriving. But inside the room, everything remained quiet, focused, held together by small movements and steady breaths. And as Daniel watched the woman work, watched the puppy that had led him here stand a little taller now, no longer trembling, he realized something had already changed, not just for them, but for him as well, something subtle, something he could not name yet, but something that would not be easily undone. More footsteps approached, steady and purposeful, followed by the soft rustle of equipment being carried inside, and two additional responders entered the room with quiet efficiency, one a tall man with a calm demeanor and a neatly trimmed beard, the other younger, moving quickly but carefully as they set down a folded stretcher and additional supplies. The air shifted again, not chaotic, not rushed, but filled with a coordinated rhythm that spoke of experience, of many moments like this handled with the same balance of urgency and control. "We will get them out one at a time," the woman said, her voice calm but firm, guiding the process without raising it, and the others nodded, already understanding their roles. Daniel stepped back slightly to give them space, though his eyes never left the corner where the mother dog and her puppies lay. The puppy that had led him here remained close, pressed against his leg, but its posture had changed, no longer tense with uncertainty, now alert in a different way, as if watching a plan unfold. The woman gently slid her hands beneath the mother dog, supporting her carefully, speaking in soft, reassuring tones as she did, and though the dog did not have the strength to move much, there was a faint response, a subtle shift that suggested she felt the difference, that she recognized the help arriving. "Easy now," the woman murmured. "We have got you." And the words settled into the room like something steady and grounding. One by one, the puppies were lifted, each movement slow, deliberate, ensuring they remained warm and close together, placed gently into a padded carrier lined with soft material, their small bodies barely stirring, but present, still present. And that was enough. Daniel found himself holding his breath without realizing it, watching each careful motion as if any sudden movement might undo the fragile progress being made. The puppy stepped forward once, as if to follow, but paused, looking between Daniel and the responders, unsure for the first time since leading him here. Daniel lowered his hand, resting it lightly against the puppy's back, a quiet reassurance, and it stayed, trusting, as it had from the beginning. The final movement came when the mother dog was lifted, supported fully now by practiced hands, placed onto the stretcher with care, her breathing still shallow but steadier than before, and for a brief moment, everything stilled, as if the room itself acknowledged the shift from waiting to action, from uncertainty to movement. "We are taking them to the clinic," the woman said, glancing toward Daniel, her eyes meeting his with a quiet gratitude that needed no explanation. "They have a chance," she added, not as a promise, but as something real, something grounded in what had already been done. Daniel nodded slowly, the words settling into him deeper than he expected, and as the responders began to move toward the doorway, carrying the stretcher and the small carrier, the puppy took a step forward again, this time more certain, its eyes fixed on the group, its body leaning in the direction they were going. But it stopped just short, turning back to Daniel once more, that same look returning, the one that had started all of this, the silent question, the quiet connection, and Daniel felt it again. That pull he could not ignore, not anymore. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and crouched just enough to meet the puppy at eye level, his hand resting gently against its side. "You are not done yet," he said softly, the words carrying both understanding and decision. and without hesitation this time. He stood and followed as the group moved out of the house. The morning light brighter now as it spilled across the clearing, the rescue vehicles waiting with open doors, the world outside continuing as it always had. But for Daniel, something had shifted, something small and quiet, yet undeniable, and as he walked beside them, the puppy keeping pace at his side, he no longer felt like someone passing through. He felt like someone who had finally chosen to stay. The doors of the rescue vehicle closed with a soft, deliberate sound, not loud, not final, just a quiet shift from one moment to the next, and Daniel stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching as the responders moved around the vehicle with practiced calm, securing equipment, checking positions, speaking in low voices that carried confidence rather than urgency. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the edges of the clearing, touching the worn boards of the abandoned house and the scattered weeds that had grown unchecked for years, and yet everything felt different, as if the place itself had been changed by what had just happened. The puppy remained at his side, its small body still but no longer tense, its gaze fixed on the vehicle as if trying to understand what came next. Daniel glanced down at it, then back at the responders, and before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward, closing the distance to the woman who had first entered the house. "Is there room for one more?" he asked, his voice steady, but quieter than usual. She looked at him for a brief moment, taking in the question, the meaning behind it, then nodded once. A small gesture, but enough. "We can make room," she said, stepping aside to open the rear door again. Daniel did not hesitate this time. He reached down and gently guided the puppy forward, its paws hesitant for just a second before it climbed up into the vehicle, turning immediately to look back at him, waiting, and Daniel followed, pulling himself up and settling onto the narrow bench along the side. The interior smelled faintly of clean fabric and antiseptic, a contrast to the dusty stillness of the house they had just left. Across from him, the small carrier held the puppies, their tiny forms nestled together, barely moving but present, and beside them, secured carefully, the mother dog lay still, her breathing shallow but more even now. The vehicle door closed again, sealing them inside, and as the engine started, a low vibration filled the space, steady and constant, the kind that signaled movement, progress, something continuing forward. Daniel rested his hands loosely on his knees, unsure of where to place them, until the puppy shifted closer, pressing lightly against his leg, and without thinking, he let his hand fall to its back, feeling the warmth, the quiet life in that small body that had somehow carried enough strength to lead him here. The vehicle pulled away from the clearing, the motion gentle at first, then smoother as it reached the main road, and through the small window, Daniel caught one last glimpse of the abandoned house, already fading into the distance, its empty frame standing silent once more, but no longer holding what it had before. The ride was not long, but it felt stretched, measured in breaths rather than miles. The responders moved quietly, checking on the mother dog, adjusting the blanket around the puppies, each action careful, intentional, and Daniel watched, absorbing it all, the way they handled each life as if it mattered, as if it was worth the time and the effort. And something in that steadiness settled into him, not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow, quiet way, like a door opening that had been closed for too long. When the vehicle finally slowed and turned into a small clinic, the building simple but clean, the kind of place that did not draw attention but did important work all the same. The doors opened again and the movement resumed. The stretcher lifted, the carrier carried inside, voices guiding each step, and Daniel followed, not because anyone told him to, but because leaving did not feel like an option anymore. Inside, the air was brighter, filled with soft sounds, distant voices, the faint hum of machines, and as the mother dog was taken further in, the puppy hesitated for just a moment at the threshold, looking up at Daniel once more, and he understood without words. Reaching down, he gave a small, reassuring touch. "Go on," he said quietly, and the puppy stepped forward, crossing into the space without fear. And Daniel stood there, watching as they disappeared deeper into the clinic, the weight of the morning settling around him, not heavy, not overwhelming, but real, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel like turning away. The clinic settled into a quieter rhythm as the doors closed behind the last set of hurried footsteps, and Daniel remained near the entrance for a moment, unsure whether to move forward or stay where he was. His eyes following the path where the mother dog and her puppies had been taken, the soft hum of overhead lights blending with distant voices and the occasional gentle clink of instruments. And it all felt strangely calm after the tension of the morning, like a place where things were given time to mend, where small chances were taken. Seriously, he finally stepped further inside, slow and deliberate, as if crossing an invisible line into something he did not fully understand yet, but was willing to face. The waiting area was simple, a few chairs lined against the wall, a small desk near the corner, and a window that let in soft daylight. And he sat down without thinking too much about it, his hands resting loosely together, the quiet stretching around him in a way that did not feel empty, just still, just patient. Minutes passed, though it was hard to measure them. And then the same woman who had led the rescue stepped back into view, her pace steady, her expression calm but softened at the edges. She approached him with a slight nod. "They are stable," she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "It is early, but they are responding well." Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, the words settling into him slowly, not as a sudden relief, but as something deeper, something that eased. A part of him he had not been able to reach before. "And the puppy?" he asked, his voice lower now, more careful. She smiled faintly, glancing toward the hallway behind her. "He has not left their side," she replied. "He keeps watch, like he did before." And something about that image stayed with Daniel. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, just right. The woman hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We will need to find them a place once they recover," she said. "A home where they are safe." Daniel nodded slowly, the idea settling in, simple in words, but heavier in meaning. He looked down at his hands, then back toward the hallway, the memory of the puppy standing in the road, waiting, leading him without fear, returning to him again and again, and without fully planning to, he spoke. "I can take him." The words came out quiet, but certain, and the woman studied him for a second, not questioning, just understanding. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Daniel paused, just for a moment, not because he doubted the answer, but because he understood what it meant. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said, and it felt different than anything he had said in a long time. It felt like a step forward rather than a retreat. The woman's expression softened further. "Then I think he already chose you," she said, a small hint of warmth in her voice, and she gestured lightly toward the hallway. "You can see him." Daniel stood, his movement steady, and followed her down the corridor, the light brighter here, the sounds clearer, and when they reached the room, he paused at the doorway, the scene inside simple but filled with quiet meaning. The mother dog lay resting, her breathing more even now. The puppies nestled close, small but present, and near them, standing watch just as before, was the puppy, its ears lifting slightly as it noticed him, its body still for a second, then moving forward with a quiet confidence that had replaced the earlier desperation. Daniel stepped inside, slower this time, not out of hesitation, but respect, and when the puppy reached him, it did not stop at a distance. It came close, pressing gently against his leg, just as it had before, and he lowered his hand to rest on its back, the gesture natural now, unforced, and in that moment, nothing needed to be said, not by him, not by anyone, because the choice had already been made, not in words, but in actions, in the quiet way a small life had reached out and been answered. And as Daniel stood there, the light falling softly through the window, the room filled with steady breaths and quiet presence, he understood something simple and lasting, that sometimes the smallest call for help does not just save a life, it reminds another how to live again.